from the BBC World Service in association with ABC and All India Radio. This is Stumped.
Hello and welcome to Stumped, your intercontinental hit of news, features and debate from the quirky world of cricket. I'm Alison Mitchell in London, and we're actually at the end of Mental Health Awareness Week here in the UK at the moment, which is always relevant, but you just feel it's particularly relevant at the moment, what with people in lockdown or coming out of lockdown and issues of isolation. Just helped a friend launch a new book specifically geared at men's mental health last night, so encouraging men to open up rather than man up. So there's a message for everybody to start this week's show with. Talking of isolation, it's nice to be able to see Jim and Charu. We've got screens set up, so as much as we're speaking to each other, we can see each other. Jim particularly enjoying a view of the budgies behind you.
Yes, well, Alison, I'll try and keep it straight, but I'm a bit off with the birds here in Sydney, as you can see. Anyway, that's what you do when you're in isolation. You talk to the manimals, the animals, the birds. And we're gradually getting out of our ISO in Sydney with some of the restrictions lifted, and people are even talking a bit more about cricket. But when will we see it? I don't know. What do you reckon, Charu?
Well, it's going to take some time for sure. But I tell you what, this is great fun, seeing each other, technology and everything else. I mean, I'm not very fond of it, but this is wonderful. I'm still in Bangalore. Of course, this is Charu Sharma for All India Radio. And the lockdown is easing pretty rapidly now in the country, and certainly here in Bangalore and Karnataka. So this morning, I got to play some tennis at the club. And tomorrow, somewhat miraculously, I've got myself a tea time. So there'll be some golf as well.
I don't know how you managed to get a tea time. I imagine the queues are massive to get on the golf course. I'll talk in a moment a bit more about cricket and its hopes for returning in England. But what is the latest in India, Charu? Because I noticed that the Indian government has announced that sports stadiums can be reopened as long as there are no spectators. So what could this mean for the IPL in particular?
Well, potentially it sounds very encouraging, doesn't it? But it's step one. And I think the intention of the government opening up sporting arenas is much more so for training purposes, so that there are a lot of sports persons saying that we're losing it completely and rapidly. And it's not really for tournaments or events at this point of time, but much more so to give the sports persons the opportunity to train. So it's a relief, yes. I think a lot of sports persons are very gingerly now trying to step out and try and reclaim their arenas. But what it has done, certainly, is woken up the giant. So the board is suddenly very excited, and there's talk once again, not that it ever went away, but it's back again, that we may be able to do a late September, all of October and early November IPL.
And of course, ramifications then what happens to the T20 World Cup scheduled for that time period in Australia later this year. Sri Lanka appear to have the virus under control somewhat. They are keen for India's white ball tour to go ahead in July. That feels like it's only just around the corner. Do you think that could happen?
Well, very little chance, really. And who knows with this virus? It seems to be morphing into all sorts of shapes and situations. So, maybe it hasn't really gone away. Which country can truly claim that it's all gone away completely? I think July is certainly too early. Maybe if it gets postponed a month or two, it might even be a good precursor for the IPL in case it does happen. Going there and touring, we all know that the commercial partners are champing at the bit. I mean, the board certainly would like this to happen. The networks, television, would certainly like this to happen.
Well, I'll tell you what, in July cricket is what's being planned to here in the UK, behind closed doors, though, of course. It's plans for a very busy men's international schedule. Bowlers returning to training under very strict health and safety guidelines this week. There's been a draft schedule in the media this week featuring plans for 6 tests, 6 one-day internationals and 6 T20s for the men between July and September. But the first opponents for England's men would be the West Indies in July. That, of course, depends on enough of their players agreeing to travel. So have a listen to the West Indies Test captain, Jason Holder.
I think each player has to be comfortable in making the step. Certainly from my perspective, I wouldn't be forcing anybody to go anywhere. It's been made clear that if we are to hop on a plane and go over to England and play, it must be safe, We've been given assurance from Cricket West Indies that we would only go over to England unless they deem it safe for us to go over and play. I think it's just everybody getting back into the workforce. It's no different from a frontline worker going into a hospital every day. It's the same risk that they're putting their lives at they're putting their lives at risk, and they're still going to make money. The longer we stay off the field, the longer it takes for us to actually make some money. But it's not only from a monetary standpoint. Like the first priority is everybody's safety. And we've been assured that the only way that the tour will possibly go ahead is if everyone could be comfortable with the measures that ECB are putting in place to roll the cricket out.
So that's Jason Holder, and he raises some interesting points there, doesn't he? What about the question of pay, for example, if players are given an open choice, similar to, we've seen in the case of some international tours around safety from, different risks, terrorism risks, for example. If players are given a choice to tour or not, should they be paid, for example, if they decide to opt out?
This has happened time and again, over many years now, decades, where problem tours, of course, could be for several reasons. You mentioned terrorism, one. It could be, many other issues. But if the boards officially ask the players, would you like to come? We're giving you the choice. Then, of course, they should be paid because, if they say no because of personal safety or, some other personal reason, then they should be paid. But if there's no real problem or there's a perceived problem, which is not agreed to by the board, in that case, you can't really choose because no professional sports person gets paid for being absent. You've got to go with the official line because it also raises the topic of that senior players particularly tend to just cry off from certain tours saying, I'm not available for this tour because it may be let's say a lower grade tour to a country which is of a lower standard. And in that case, if you're voluntarily saying, I'm not available for this tour, why should you then have a contract or a contract that's paid in full?
I suppose that's something for boards to work out with their players, isn't it? And Jim, it is difficult if a board clears a tour and says, we have had this signed off from government, it's been deemed, safe enough, the measures we've put in place. But what is risk to one person is a different perception of risk to another. And therefore, if a player then says, my personal circumstances, I don't feel comfortable to tour. I mean, these are unprecedented times.
An example of this at the moment in Australia is with the rugby league season about to start in a week's time. A number of players have said they don't want to be vaccinated against the flu. And they've been told basically, well, no vaccine, no play. They've got their reasons, whatever they may be. But I also think the reaction of the people who run the game is fair in that regard. If you're not going to be vaccinated, well, don't expect to play. But in terms of this sort of moral outrage that some people might feel about their safety being compromised by going overseas or anywhere to play because they're not certain, well, that's a freedom of choice, I suppose. But they can't expect to be paid if they're not going to put their hand up and play particularly if they're under contract. So. You've got all these sort of personal liberty issues and the rest of it around the whole argument of when is it deemed by the authorities safe for everyone to play.
Now, don't forget you can subscribe to Stumped every week from your favourite podcast app. Just search for BBC Stumped. Last week, we took you to the streets of Mumbai and heard from locals who are suffering major withdrawal symptoms from the absence of their favourite sport.
We worship cricket, so we want it back very bad.
I am definitely missing cricket, more so because this is our time for the annual IPL season.
One of the things a sports enthusiast misses the most is playing cricket.
If you talk of cricket, it is the lifeblood of all Indians.
So Indians are obsessed with cricket, as we all know, but where did that passion first come from? Well, that's the subject of a fascinating book that we're going to take a closer look at this week on Stumped. It's called Cricket Country, an Indian Odyssey in the Age of Empire, and it focuses on the 1911 All India Cricket Team's tour of Britain and its importance to the development of Indian identity through cricket. Now, the book's recently been shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize, the most valuable non-fiction writing prize in the UK. And I'm delighted to say that its author, Prashant Kidambi, joins us now. Prashant, welcome to Stumped. I gather this is the first sports book to be nominated for this prize, so many congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on the show.
A pleasure. Take us back to 1911 then. I mean, we're talking nearly 4 decades before India became an independent nation. So how did that tour come about?
Yes, this is one of the most fascinating episodes in the history of Indian cricket because it marks the birth of the idea of India on the cricket pitch. And my book really tells the story of how this team came to be put together. And through the story of this team and its tour, it also tells the story of early Indian cricket, how cricket took root in India, how different communities took to the game, and how eventually these different communities came together to form a composite Indian cricket team.
Well, we've got Charu Sharma here, Prashant, for All India Radio. He's got a few things to ask you as well.
Well, thank you, Alison. Hello, Prashant. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Just a couple of questions. Of course, I've got many, but let's begin with, what was the legacy of the tour? I mean, did it go a long way in helping India identify itself as a nation rather than just little pockets of people?
Yes. One of the arguments of the book is that we can see the coming together of this idea of India on the cricket pitch. The book shows how it took 12 years and 3 failed attempts before an Indian cricket team took to the field. This was a team that was put together by a coalition of British imperial interests and Indian interests. The Indian interests comprising the Maharajas, as well as rich Indian business families like the Tatas. So in a curious way, looking back from the standpoint of today's very hyper-nationalist approach to the Indian cricket team, the first ever Indian cricket team was actually formed by a coalition of imperial and Indian interests. It was not a case of empire versus nation.
Yeah, I'm also very curious to know, there are references to a place called Tellicherry in Kerala, where I actually played some cricket matches, where they've discovered 200 years of cricket in Tellicherry. And I said, what, 200 years? They said, yeah. Well, they used to play that far back. But guess what? The English used to get together a whole bunch of washer people, who largely wash clothes. And that used to be the contest. Where did cricket get this elitism tag if it was so, spread out amongst all communities in India? When did that happen?
Well, one of the things that the book does is to identify 2 sorts of dynamics that were at play in the spread and consolidation of Indian cricket. One was a dynamic that involved different communities sort of taking to the game, forming cricket clubs, playing against each other. And this was largely happening in different Indian towns and cities. And it was a process that really begins to happen. It starts with Bombay in the 1840s and 1850s. But by the end of the 19th century, this is happening across India. This dynamic, one might say, is the popularization of cricket from below. On the other hand, you also have a second dynamic, which is unfolding from above. And this is a dynamic that involves Indian elites who take to the game for different reasons and who see in this game a vehicle for their own interests. So, for example, the Maharajas see cricket as a way of ingratiating themselves with the British. So, Indian elites had begun to see possibilities for self-advancement, social mobility through cricket. So, essentially, what you then have are these 2 dynamics, and these 2 dynamics continue to this day. So, you can see, for example, today, you have cricket is India's most popular sport, but cricket is also a game that is run by very small numbers of people who have enormous power and enormous influence. Many politicians get involved in the running of the game. So the book really shows how both these 2 dynamics, both these 2 parallel processes were at play right from the beginning.
And just very quickly, Prashant, even now, selection always draws a fair amount of controversy. So just very quickly, how was this team selected from people around the country?
Very good question. And in fact, I pointed out a moment ago that it had taken 12 years and 3 failed attempts for an Indian cricket team to come together. For much of that time, the reason that it was very hard to put together an Indian cricket team was over the question of what is a representative Indian cricket team? What should be the basis of selection? Cricket itself was organized on what one might call communal line. And there was a whole colonial sociology of Indian communities that had informed the spread of the game and its organization. And that then meant that different communities often contested the representation that they were given in the Indian cricket team. So, for example, in 1904, an Indian cricket team was supposed to come out to England, and matters had advanced so much that the tickets had been booked and so on. But at the last selection meeting, the Hindus and the Muslims and the Parsis couldn't agree on the composition of the team. So the Parsis felt that their numbers ought to be more. The Muslims and Hindus all felt that the Parsis already had too many players in the team. So this idea of what makes for a representative Indian team has been a running thread throughout the history of Indian cricket.
It's Jim Maxwell for the ABC here in Sydney, Prashant, and very nice to hear your voice describing some wonderful history. There's a quote from the sociologist Ashish Nandy that describes cricket as an Indian game accidentally discovered by the English. Now, is cricket India's biggest symbol of national pride?
Yes, it's very interesting that you should bring that up. And I start the book with that quote. The reason I had it there, it was actually, as you pointed out, the Indian sociologist Ashish Nandy who made this point. And I think he kind of said it at the time in a tongue-in-cheek way. But it's now become such a truism because it's kind of taken for granted that cricket really is an Indian game that the English just happen to have discovered, And the book is called Cricket Country. And I was playing on this the title of a very famous book by the distinguished English poet Edmund Blunden, who wrote his book, Cricket Country, in 1944, in the midst of the Second World War. And Blunden's book was very much about the roots of the English game, and he saw cricket as quintessentially English. And he was recalling his time as a young boy, the pre-1914 era, when cricket was really sort of represented the rights of rural male camaraderie in the English countryside. And his book had no subtitle. It was simply called Cricket Country because it was taken for granted that there could only be one cricket country. Today, if you use the word cricket country, there's only one country that springs to mind, and it's not England. So I was playing on this idea of how this a game that was regarded as quintessentially English, as something that no other communities could understand, becomes this obsession, national obsession, in the country that the British conquered and colonized. So I think there's a great historical irony there.
Prashant, you share your story very well indeed. It's it's fascinating to listen to, a fascinating read as well. Good luck with the Wolfson Award. When will you find out?
It's on the 15th of June. Okay. There are 6 books in play for the award.
Well, congratulations on being nominated. Best of luck. Thank you so much for joining us on Stumped.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that's all we've got time for on this week's Stumped on All India Radio. You can keep in touch with us on Twitter via @BBCWS Sport, via the hashtag BBC Stumped. My thanks to Jim Maxwell and Charu Sharma, and to you, of course, for listening. Stay safe and join us again next time. Bye-bye.
Stumped is a BBC sport production for the BBC World Service in association with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and All India Radio.